Inside Queen Mary's private sitting room at Marlborough House, a lady in waiting once watched the Queen's gloved finger drift along a shelf and stop above a small jade figure. And every soul in that household understood that by nightfall the piece would be wrapped, carried quietly up the stairs, and set among the Queen's own things as a gift its owner had never once offered. If you find yourself pulled into these quiet corners of the palace, subscribing costs nothing, and more of these untold stories are already waiting behind the bell. So watch how it actually happened. The finger slows, it stops. The Queen admires the little figure aloud, softly, almost to herself, the way you might praise the weather. And the owner, standing right there in her own drawing room, says nothing, because there is nothing to say. You do not tell a queen, no. You do not remind her that the thing on the shelf is yours. You smile, you dip your head, and you let it go. By evening, it is gone. Picture that room for a moment, the shelf, the gloved hand slowing, and ask yourself what you would have done, because the honest answer is the same one they all reached. Nothing. None of them did anything. That one small movement of a gloved hand is why the women closest to the most flawless consort the British monarchy ever produced learned to dread the summons to her side. A call to her private rooms was an honour. Any lady at court would have said so out loud. And yet, for the seasoned women who actually served her, that same call was a thing to be quietly feared. Keep one question in your mind as this goes on. What could make grown women, experienced courtiers, who had spent decades near thrones, quietly fear a summons from a queen who never once raised her voice? Because that is the strange part. She never shouted. She never had to. Queen Mary of Teck was the consort of King George V, and in public she was the most disciplined figure the monarchy has ever put on show. Where other royals softened with age, or bent under grief, or let the mask slip for a photographer, she did not. Not once. The record of her is a wall of stillness. You can see it for yourself. The towering toque hats stacked high and straight above her brow like a piece of architecture. The parasol held at one exact angle, never a degree off. A back that never curved, in private sorrow or public strain, across 50 years of photographs. Line the pictures up, decade by decade, and the posture is identical every time. She built an image with no visible crack in it, and she kept that image for a lifetime. We know what it cost the women around her because one of them wrote it down. Mabel, Countess of Airlie, served Queen Mary for more than half a century. Near the end of her own life, she set it all into a memoir called Thatched with Gold. Lady Airlie stood beside her mistress through reigns, through 2 wars, through the funerals of kings, and she described a queen who demanded of the women around her exactly the rigidity she demanded of herself. The stillness was not just for the cameras, it was the rule of the whole household. The court called her flawless, and on the surface the word fit perfectly. The ladies who dressed her, who walked a half step behind her, who answered every bell she rang, served her without a single visible mistake. Every curtsy was correct, every glove came off at the right instant, and not a moment sooner. From the outside, it looked like devotion, smooth and complete, and underneath it ran a quiet dread that none of them would put into words for years and years, which brings us straight back to that jade figure. Was it simply theft? A rich woman helping herself to a pretty thing because nobody in the room could stop her? Or was it something stranger? Something that reached down into the very centre of who she was? The women who served her longest reached an answer to that only in old age, once the years and a new reign had finally freed them to speak. And it was not the answer you would expect, but the vanishing of objects, the little pieces that quietly migrated from other people's shelves to hers. That was only the surface of it. What truly bound those women, what turned an honour into something they had to steel themselves for before they knocked, was not what Queen Mary took out of the room. It was the code she enforced inside it, the exact rules for how a glove was worn, for the moment a lady might sit, for whether she was permitted to speak at all. Rules kept not with a raised voice, and never with a reproach, but with something the household came to fear far more, a silence colder than any words, and the body had its own rules. Queen Mary stood for hours without visible fatigue, at investitures, at garden parties, at the long file past of a state occasion, and she expected the women beside her, some of them decades younger, to stand exactly as long. To sag was to fail, a test that was never announced out loud. Mabel, Countess of Airlie, who was at her side for more than half a century, remembered ladies half the Queen's age shifting their weight and aching, while Mary held her place like a figure cast in something harder than flesh. Endurance was not vanity, it was proof of loyalty, measured in hours on tired feet, and the lapses were punished without a word. Gloves were never removed at the wrong moment, and the lady who forgot, who peeled one off before the Queen had given the smallest sign, did not hear about it afterward. That was the point. There was no scolding, no raised voice, only that cold quiet settling over the room, a silence colder than any reproach, and once it fell it stayed. A shout ends, a silence you have to sit inside, upright, watching the gloved hands turn the pages of a letter, not knowing when or whether you had been forgiven. Staff said it was the worst thing she did, and she did it by doing nothing at all. So hold that closed door in your mind, the door to her private rooms, because the same will that ruled a glove ruled something far larger, and it reached well past the palace walls. They called it collecting. By the height of King George V's reign, it was a reputation that ran the length of the country. Her eye missed nothing. A gloved finger would drift along a shelf and stop above some small thing, a snuff box, a piece of jade, a painted miniature, and she would admire it aloud, softly, and the thing was as good as gone. The owner had not offered it. The owner would not have dreamed of refusing. A former footman recalled how the trade itself prepared for her. Antique dealers priced their finest stock high before a royal visit, and not because they hoped to sell it to the Queen. They did it to make the taking awkward. A piece marked at a steep figure was harder to accept as a passing gift, and the dealers knew the Queen's eye missed nothing, and that her thanks left almost no room for refusal. A high-priced tag was a small wall. Even that did not always hold. If you have ever tidied a shelf before an important guest arrived, moved the good vase where they would not comment on it, now multiply that instinct across every great house in England. That is the reputation we are talking about. Because the dread had left the palace entirely. Hostesses across England learned to hide their treasures before Queen Mary arrived. On the morning of her visit, a favourite bowl came off the mantelpiece. A good clock went into a back room. A jade figure not unlike the one that would later vanish from a Marlborough House shelf was quietly carried upstairs and left there until the royal car had gone. Women who would have curtsied to the floor for her spent the hours before she came arranging their own homes so the Queen would have nothing to admire. And here the two halves of her finally meet. The discipline that governed a glove and the impulse that emptied a stranger's shelf were never two separate things. They were one continuous will. Control of the room, control of the people standing in it, and control of everything the room contained. The posture that had not bent in 50 years of photographs, and the finger that stopped above the jade came from the same place inside her. She held herself, and she held whatever she wanted, with exactly the same grip, which makes the guilty verdict look simple. A cold woman who took what was not hers, feared up and down the country, obeyed out of terror. That is the story the anecdotes seem to tell, and it would be an easy one to leave you with. And yet the people best placed to hand you that verdict would not do it. The ladies who had stood beside her through those long afternoons, who had sat inside the silence and hidden their own ornaments, and watched objects travel up the stairs, the women who feared her most, refused to call her a thief. Here is where the easy story breaks. So hold your verdict one more minute, because the ones who knew her best refused to call her what you're probably already thinking. Lady Airlie was the first of them to try to explain why. She had served Mary longer than almost anyone, had seen every cold quiet and every gloved acquisition up close, and when she finally came to write it down, she did not reach for the word theft or coldness or cruelty. She reached for something stranger. She insisted the coldness was armour, not cruelty, and there was one place, far from the palace and far from its crowded shelves, where that armour came off entirely, where the finger stopped drifting and the silence broke, and the women who served her would have barely recognised the queen they feared. That place was Badminton House. When the Second World War came, the palace judged the old queen safer in the Gloucestershire countryside than in a London full of bombs, and so Queen Mary, by then in her 70s, was sent out to the Beaufort estate, and something in her came loose there. The staff of the house had heard all about the woman who was arriving, and then they met her, and could not square the two. She went at the ivy on the walls, as though it had insulted her personally. Clearing ivy and hauling scrap became her daily campaign. She pressed soldiers, gardeners, secretaries, anyone within reach, into service, then led them off into the woods to tear the overgrowth down and drag it away. She gathered scrap metal for the war effort with the same tireless eye that had once travelled along other people's shelves. Only now the taking had a purpose, and nobody dreaded it. Gardeners found the Queen elbow deep in mud. Evacuee children, London kids who had never seen royalty and were not much impressed by it, stood easily at her side. Staff who had braced for the palace queen waited for the reprimands that never came. She thanked the gardeners by name. She sat among the evacuee children as though rank had been left behind in London. This was plain warmth, the ordinary humankind, and it was the one thing the great houses of England had never once seen her spend. This is the woman her ladies never met. So ask yourself, which one was the real Queen Mary, the one held rigid inside the toque hat, or the one in the mud? Lady Airlie gave her answer late, in the memoir she called Thatched with Gold. The coldness, she insisted, was armour and not cruelty. To see the armour, you have to go back before the throne, before the toque hats, before any of it, to a girl known simply as Mary of Teck. She had been raised in genteel, near poverty, read that phrase slowly, because it carries the whole weight. Her family had the royal blood, and almost none of the money to match it. She grew up an outsider among cousins, who never once had to think about the cost of a thing, watching a world that was hers by name, and not by means. And then, against everything she had been raised to expect, she married into a throne. Think about what that does to a person. The rigidity that terrified her ladies, the gloves never removed at the wrong moment, the posture that did not bend in 50 years of photographs. She turned all of it on herself first, long before she corrected a lady with a silence colder than any reproach. She had corrected herself the very same way. The discipline was the only defence she ever built. She built it young, and she never once set it down. And here is the cruel arithmetic of it. A defence that saves a frightened child can harden into the thing that frightens everyone else. The armour that once kept Mary of Teck safe became the wall her ladies pressed against for half a century. She never meant it as a weapon. She simply never learned to take it off, except, it turned out, in the mud at badminton, where no shelf held anything she needed to want. Her ladies could not say any of this while she lived. Not while King George VI held the throne and the whole household still turned on her rhythms. Only in old age, with the Queen long buried and the years having loosened every tongue, did the women who had curtsied to her finally speak. If you find yourself pulled into these quiet corners of the palace, subscribing costs nothing, and more of these untold stories are already waiting behind the bell, because what those old women finally said is the strangest part of the whole story. Sit with what her own ladies decided, because it is stranger and sadder than theft. And it is the answer to the question you have carried since that first shelf. They did not call Queen Mary heartless. They did not call her a thief. What they concluded, after a lifetime of watching her up close, was that she had disciplined herself so completely that affection and acquisition had become the same gesture. She had taught herself never to reach for what she loved, and so the love came out sideways, as a hand closing quietly over an object. That is why they feared her, not the taking itself, the fusion behind it. A woman for whom wanting a thing and owning it had collapsed into one silent motion, which carries you back to the jade figure that vanished from a shelf at Marlborough House, the small green piece she admired aloud, softly, that was wrapped and carried up to her rooms by evening. The owner had not offered it. No one had asked. Between the wanting and the having, there was no gap at all, no pause where a refusal might have lived. It was never simple theft. It was the truest thing about her. The gloved finger drifting along the shelf and stopping was not greed. It was the only language for love she had left. So the gap between the flawless queen in the photographs and the private one closes here, on a single image. Not a tyrant, not only a frightened child either, a woman who had learned to want in silence and to take without a word. The toque hat set at its exact angle, the parasol held at its precise degree, and the gloved hand, still and closed, resting over whatever it had decided to keep.